Hi, Rich.
Hi, Michelle. How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Good. Good to see you.
So we should, I guess, introduce ourselves. My name is Michelle Goldberg. I'm a senior writer for Newsweek and the Daily Beast, and the author of a couple of books, including The Means of Reproduction, Sex, Power, and the Future of the World.
And I'm Rich Lowry, editor of National Review magazine.
And we were going to start by talking about the latest attempt by Rick Perry to make himself, I guess, relevant to this campaign. And I'm curious, between the tax plan and the rebirth of birtherism, whether you think he's going to succeed. You obviously know the right a lot better than I do, whether he could succeed in capturing, once again, capturing the kind of anti-Romney mantle.
Yeah, I think it's too early to write him off, just because there is a widespread discontent with Romney and a hunger for some sort of alternative. And on paper, he's a much more viable alternative than Herman Cain or any of the rest of them. And he has a lot of resources. So all those things are to the good. But it's amazing the damage he did to himself in those debates. And I think in one sense it's irreparable, because even if he performs flawlessly...
So you do think it was irreparable?
Well, I think it's irreparable in this sense. Even if he performs flawlessly from now until June, and that's a big assumption, because we saw with his dipping his toe bizarrely back into birtherism, that flawless and Rick Perry aren't words that go well together. But even if he were to perform flawlessly, there's still going to be that kernel of doubt that when the lights are their brightest and the pressure is at its highest and the stakes are at their highest, in October of 2012, if he's a candidate against Barack Obama, they're just going to throw it away and blow it on some act of mindless idiocy,
But when you talk about kind of dipping his toe back into birtherism being a mistake, it might have been a kind of strategic error, but it clearly wasn't a slip-up, right? It clearly seemed to be something that he, in as much as he makes conscious decisions, that he consciously decided to do. And isn't there a big part of the Republican base that remains hungry for that sort of thing?
They're hungry for combativeness. Well, they're hungry for combativeness and someone who won't play by the rules. And that was part of the appeal of Sarah Palin, it was part of the appeal of Donald Trump, it was part of the appeal of Michelle Bachmann, it was part of the appeal of Herman Cain now. And, but I don't think there's an appetite for birtherism. And my understanding is that Parade interview that brought this back up again was from, a while ago when he met with Donald Trump. And I just think it was, I don't think it was calculation. I think it was just...
Well, right, but then he kind of doubled down on it. And, as opposed to... He could have easily disavowed it. He could have said this was before I had seen the birth certificate. Instead, he has said, well, it's fun to needle him. And I think that this is an issue that should be raised.
Well, he did kind of a soft doubling down, because as you say, he said, oh, this is a distraction, but gosh, isn't it fun to poke at him a little bit on this? And then that was what he said early on the day he... unveiled his flat tax, and then later he just said, oh, this is a distraction, let's not talk about this. So I'd be shocked if he ever says anything like what he said the last couple of days again.
So, of the flat tax, do people on the right, from where I sit, his new tax proposal seems like the worst of all possible worlds, right, in that it kind of contains all of the regressive elements of a flat tax and the kind of tax cuts for the very wealthy, which might be a good thing from the Republican point of view, or at least from some parts of the Republican point of view, but is obviously, I think would be not just kind of very bad for the economy, it's obviously very, very unpopular. So it kind of has all the bad parts of a flat tax with all of the bad parts of the current tax code, because if you really, it just seems so crazy to me, this idea that you basically have a choice between two tax codes and that this is going to somehow simplify things as opposed to adding a whole new layer of complication, because most people are just going to have to figure out what their taxes are going to be under two separate systems before they can make a choice.
Yeah, the way I look at it, I look slightly differently, but I'm not a huge fan of it either. is if you have a real flat tax, that means you're going to raise taxes on the middle and people lower down the income scale and massively cut them at the top. And it's obviously a huge political problem. And to get around that, Rick Perry proposes a flat tax. It's not really a flat tax because it's optional by nature, which means that everyone who would pay more under the flat tax, meaning people in the middle and then down lower, will just keep with the current code, and then everyone who would pay less under the flat tax, people at the top, will pay the flat tax. So what it is kind of basically just a 20% rate, a new 20% rate for people at the higher end. So it avoids one political problem, but then in the course of trying to get around that, creates more problems, one of which is that, as you point out, if the whole appeal here is simplicity, it's not really that simple just to layer another system on top of the current system we have now.
Do you have any sense of where this kind of came from? I mean, often when a candidate kind of comes out with new proposals, you can somehow trace their intellectual pedigree. I mean, except for Herman Cain, in which case it's just some guy who works at Wells Fargo.
A guy named Rich Lowry, though.
I know, but you must be getting tons of calls about that, right?
I'm very defensive.
When I heard that, I Googled it immediately, and I said, really? Rich Lowry made your tax plan?
Is it that bad that Rich Lowry came up with it?
Right. Well, since it just seems so strange. But let's talk about that later. But does this even have any kind of roots in conservative thought, or is this really? I mean, where did this dual system? Where did this come from?
Oh well, first of all, the flat tax is.
I know the flat tax has been around for a long
back,
time.
Obviously, the optional flat tax is, as far as I know, at least one of the most prominent people to advance it was Steve Moore, who years ago said this would be a good idea. And it's kind of funny because you have almost a Steve Moore. Intramural Steve Moore tax debate going on within the Republican Party, because he also had a hand in formulating 999. It was sort of meant to be wed the virtues of flat tax with fair tax and appeal to kind of radical tax reformers on both sides. And you have that idea, which has Steve Moore's fingerprints on it, against the optional flat tax, which also has Steve Moore's fingerprints on it.
Are you troubled by the fact that, I mean, the flat tax, like you said, has been around for a long time, and it was, the centerpiece of Steve Forbes' campaign. But it used to be considered a fairly radical position on the right. Kind of progressive income taxes has been around for a long time. It is, very broadly popular. I mean, what do you think about the fact that this is kind of inching towards becoming the normative position among conservatives, so that even Mitt Romney is kind of flirting with it or saying that he likes some elements of it? I mean, is that something, are you celebrating that, or are you troubled by that?
Well, I'm celebrating the drift of the debate. I mean, I do think Republicans should be in favor of some big, bold ideas, and I think Herman Cain's 999 is flawed, deeply flawed, but has really sparked this debate. And, Mitt Romney, you have to give him the best odds for being the nominee at the moment. So anything that can be done to kind of nail him down on tax reform and on entitlement reform is very important. And it's
right, but we're not talking about tax reform. I mean, we're not talking about tax reform. We're talking about, one of the things that seems interesting to me is that, throughout the Bush administration, there seemed to be a real backing away from kind of old rhetoric about kind of shiftless, lazy, poor people, right? Welfare reform had already happened. Bush talked about compassionate conservatism, whether or not that was just kind of empty rhetoric. You didn't hear a lot of people talking about kind of the lazy underclass. And all of a sudden now you have, again, this rhetoric of that the real problem is that poor people aren't paying enough taxes. There seems to be a real willingness to raise taxes at the bottom. I mean, to make the tax code more regressive, as you just said. Do you see that as being ultimately? I mean, is that ultimately the direction that you want to go in? We're not just talking about whether bold reform is called for. We're talking about whether we want to make the tax code more regressive at a time of rising inequality.
Well, first of all, I just finished my thought. Anything that can drag Mitt Romney into being more specific about tax reform and entitlement reform, I think is a very good thing, because he has a 59-point plan that basically says nothing about those two major, huge elephants in the room. So I think the drift of the debate is a healthy one, and it's not just folks on the right. I think it's pretty much a consensus that a flatter simpler tax reform with less loopholes is a very good thing, and kind of
it's not a it's a consensus that simpler tax reform, not flatter.
Well, Bowles-Simpson, which is big bipartisan commission, advocated for flatter, simpler, with less loopholes. And I think most economists would agree, if all things being equal, if you can have lower rates and less double taxation of capital, that's more economically efficient. But let me get to your point just about the regressivity here, if that's a word. Did I just make up a word? The regressiveness of these plans. It is notable how the last couple of years it's become conventional wisdom on the right that it's a huge problem in the tax code that you have so many people not paying federal income taxes. And this is a really tricky thing and very much a departure, because both Reagan and George W. Bush were very much complicit, deliberately set out to take people off of the income rolls. So I sort of, so if you're going to rectify that problem, it means you're going to raise taxes on people and the lower income people and middle income people. And Herman Cain's 999 is the best example of that. So politically, it's just very, very perilous ground. And
not just, politically, but also I would think to some degree ideologically and morally. Unless you're kind of want to go into full-on Ayn Rand territory, don't even conservatives see raising taxes on poor people at a time of kind of widespread economic immiseration to be a troubling idea?
Yeah, I don't favor it. It doesn't make sense to me. But there's
why is this idea? What is it that's making this kind of catch on and resonate with people? What is it that had the audience at the last Republican debate applauding when Herman Cain repeated his belief that if you're poor and you don't have a job, it's your own fault?
Yeah, it was interesting because the guy who corrected him on that was Ron Paul, who you usually don't look to for
for compassionate conservatism.
For sort of reasonableness. I think there are a couple things. One, on the taxes, is just the idea that we all should pay. We're all in this together. It's kind of
we believe we're all in this together. But since when do conservatives believe that?
Well, it's kind of a reverse version of Elizabeth Warren, saying that everyone has to pay their taxes because no one gets rich alone. So conservatives are saying, yeah, if we're all in this together, everyone should pay income taxes. And then a political theory, which I'm not sure is correct, which says that if you're not paying taxes, federal income taxes specifically, that will make you more likely to vote for benefits for yourself because you don't have any skin in the game. So,
right, and just to be clear, and you're being clear about this, we're not talking about not paying taxes or not paying federal taxes. We're just talking about not paying federal income taxes, right? So but that's, the idea that, again, I guess it shouldn't surprise me that they would want to kind of construct the tax code so as to affect people's political behavior, despite kind of all of the conservative railing against using the tax code for social engineering, which you often hear. But the cynicism of that political theory that you want to raise taxes on people, which I don't even totally understand, that you want to raise income taxes on people because that will make them feel like they're part of the so-called 53%, and so they'll be even less generous to people that they see as being below them, so that they'll be less likely to.
It's a fear. I don't think it's cynical at all. It's a fear that if you are not paying anything to the federal government, And
which is not what we're talking about, because these are people who are paying.
Correct.
If you have a job, you're paying payroll taxes.
No, right, but they're focusing just on federal income taxes, which I think is a mistake in itself. But I'm just trying to explain to you what the thinking is. That if you're not paying anything in federal income taxes, it's all upside to you to have higher government spending because you're paying for none of it. And I mean, this seems a completely intuitive idea to me. And if you go back to the founders, they had the fear, a similar fear in a different context of
so property, so they don't let people
being
vote.
Under assault.
Right? I mean, often, right? So you had laws kind of saying that you couldn't vote if you weren't a property owner.
Right, but I mean,
we moved quite a bit away from that sort of thing.
Do you not see why? Let's just say, in theory, you're paying no taxes whatsoever, no federal income, no payroll, nothing. You wouldn't fear that such a person in our theoretical vacuum here would have an incentive to vote in such a way that there's more government spending because this person feels it not at all, doesn't have to pay anything. I mean, the idea to me seems perfectly commonsensical and intuitive, although I think it's misapplied in the context of federal.
I think that a person who is kind of that far down the income ladder, if they're voting for more government services, it's because they have kind of an urgent need for those services, as opposed to having some kind of theoretical.
No, but I'm trying to get to the principle here.
Right.
Let's say it's a middle income person. Let's say it's a rich person. Let's say it's Warren Buffett.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not paying anything, no federal income, nothing, payroll, nothing, wouldn't that sort of net out in your interest to vote for higher government spending? Because the effect of it on you is nil. I mean, the practical effect of higher spending, eventually we have to pay for it in higher taxes. But if you're totally held harmless in that, why would you worry about that whatsoever?
I guess, but I think that there's a big difference between talking about somebody like Warren Buffett or talking about people who are kind of.
But I'm just trying to see whether you just
I kind
even
of understand.
even in a vacuum reject the whole idea.
I understand the argument in principle. But again, where I reject it is the idea that the idea that kind of that's how people go about their political decision making. I mean, that's
right. No, as a practical matter, I probably agree with you on that. But I'm just trying to. You seem to think this whole idea is so bizarre and alien. But I'm trying to get you to address this theoretical question, which I think gets down to the crux of the principle. But you won't. You don't want to go there. So,
no, I guess, okay, so theoretically, I mean, it's one of those things like kind of libertarianism, right? Theoretically, I can kind of understand some of the principles behind it, although it seems to me to ignore a lot about the way human beings actually exist in the world.
Right, but so you do or don't understand if someone is totally held harmless and not paying anything, or a person in a vacuum would have an interest in seeing more government spending, in theory.
Yeah, I understand the principle. Okay, so, well, then let's kind of maybe move on to your tax plan, Herman Cain's 999. Again, I think that a lot of this, it seems to me, although you've kind of talked about the intellectual foundations of this, but there also seems to be almost a cultural shift in this idea, in this sudden kind of popularity for a much, much, much more regressive tax code. I mean, it's amazing that you have now at least some conservatives applauding the idea of a national sales tax. I mean, where did that come from?
Well, it's not particularly new. Dick Armey and Billy Tozen, when they were in Congress back in the 90s, had a roadshow where they went around debating whether the flat tax or the consumption tax, sales tax, would be a better idea. And again, in terms of economic efficiency, if we just move to some sort of consumption tax and junked everything else, that'd be much more efficient. The question
efficient
is
for
it,
who? I mean,
for the entire economy. I mean, it would be massively pro-growth. But
wait, how do you figure that? I mean, how would that not be a huge break on spending?
Well, it would be a huge boon to investment, and it'd be much simpler. You know, Perry touts the massive reductions that in compliance costs he'd supposedly get from his optional flat tax. This would be something that we actually would get those sort of savings in compliance. So I think as a theoretical economic matter, it's much, much better. It's just that there are all sorts of fishhooks in getting there, and all sorts of political fishhooks. And the biggest one is it is would hit people further down the income scale much harder than the current very complex and confusing system.
I was surprised to see the most kind of recent polls that Herman Cain still seems to be on top. I had thought that after the last debate, where he kind of seemed unable to explain the mechanics of this supposedly very simple new tax plan, and then followed by his kind of inability to square his extreme anti-government, general kind of libertarian stance with his belief in forced childbirth. I had thought he was done, or that it was going to, that it was going to be, we were going to, Donald Trump, Michelle Bachmann, Rick Perry, Herman Cain. Eventually people are going to have to accept the fact that they're about to nominate Mitt Romney. But it seems like that's not happening, or is it just not happening kind of fast enough for the polls to pick it up?
It's hard to see. I agree with Matthew Dowd, who was on TV the other day, the former Bush pollster, saying there's just a huge forgiveness factor with Herman Cain because people like him, and there's just no substitute in politics for being liked. It gets you a lot, and it provides a big margin for error. But I would imagine if he keeps bumping along like this, that it's going to erode him over time. And I'm a conservative in a lot of ways. One of them is that when people say everything is different in politics and there's some huge, hugely innovative new model to do something, it's probably not going to work at the end of the day. And Cain kind of going on a national book tour instead of working those early states and building an organization in those early states, I think is probably going to tell over time. I can't be totally confident in that, but I think it will. And he's got to win in Iowa, so he should be spending the bulk of his time in Iowa. Now, maybe he's right.
Do you think that he's even really serious, or do you think that this was his kind of very a fantastic publicity gambit gone further than anybody could have imagined?
I think there's that element to it. I think put him on a truth serum, he'd be very surprised where he is and where this has gone.
Right. I mean, this seems like some kind of bad comedy, right? Where somebody, like the producers or something, where somebody decides to start a kind of a presidential campaign as a way to supplement a book tour and boost sales and raise speaking fees, and all of a sudden, kind of surprising everyone, finds himself the front runner.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of unbelievable. But now it's a huge opportunity for him, and if I were him and I want to be president of the United States, I would be pouring all these resources he's getting, $1 million a week, into building a serious organization and having a serious go at it. And that starts with Iowa, where he's leading in the polls, but it's not clear, how sustainable that is, or whether that would translate on caucus night without organization on the ground. But there's a hunger for someone who's not Mitt Romney, and at the moment a hunger for someone who's not Rick Perry as well. So this is the huge opening for Herman Cain. I just think it's a very volatile situation. It wouldn't surprise me if Cain wins Iowa, at the end of the day, but it wouldn't surprise me if anyone else wins Iowa as well. And you've seen in the chattering class a little bump for Newt Gingrich. Apparently his fundraising is up a little bit. He's gotten good reviews in the debates. So there's just been this free-floating conservative sentiment that's briefly touched down on several candidates now. And it may have touched Herman Cain, and then it'll move on to someone else. But it's a really unusual process because you have such a weak front runner in Mitt Romney, and you have this kind of roiling populist anti-establishment sentiment out there.
Right, that seems like it has nowhere to go.
Vehicle. That's right. It desperately wants to find a vehicle, and at the moment it's Herman Cain.
Do you actually think that there's a possibility that Herman Cain could be the nominee? I mean, I saw on TV the other day, Bill Maher bet someone $1 million to $1 that he wouldn't be. I mean, I would, I'm certainly not in a position to bet $1 million, but I would, I would bet quite a bit that it will never happen. Do you think it could?
It seems very unlikely, but I wouldn't totally rule it out. I don't know, 10% or something.
So what are conservatives going to do? Or not conservatives, because I know there are conservatives who like Mitt Romney. I mean, what are they going to do as it becomes kind of increasingly clear that they don't seem to have an alternative?
Well, the history, unfortunately, and my colleague Ramesh Panu wrote a great column about this for Bloomberg. The history is that conservatives don't coalesce around anyone and don't find a suitable vehicle they can all agree on, and they split their vote, and it nominates the establishment guy. And if Romney's going to win the nomination, who knows? Maybe he makes play in Iowa, wins New Hampshire, and closes, shuts the door in a more convincing fashion that's ever been done before in Republican politics. But I think it's more likely that he is going to have to get nominated on the John McCain plan, which is kind of scooting through by the skin of his teeth, depending on a divided up conservative vote. And McCain didn't have a plausible path to the Republican nomination. He had an implausible path, and it just happened that everything broke the right way because conservatives didn't settle on an alternative, and everything...
Well, and what's interesting is that a lot of them thought the alternative was Mitt Romney.
They did. Yeah, and we
right.
did.
So this is something amazing too about the Republican Party, that the conservative alternative 4 years ago is now the unacceptably squishy moderate.
Yeah, I mean it's because he's in that establishment slot that he wasn't in 2008. Part of it, a huge part of it, is that he's not running against John McCain this time, and a lot of us were just very eager for any alternative to John McCain last time around, and Mitt Romney was the most viable vehicle.
Are you eager for an alternative to Mitt Romney?
What's that?
Are you eager for an alternative to Mitt Romney?
Yeah, I'm eager. It's just I'm not sure who it is, and I think it's a very weak field. It's I think they've been doing better in the debates kind of collectively, but there's a whole number of candidates that I wish had run, and I think would be a much stronger field for it.
Do you think there's any chance? I mean, I kind of thought this would happen after the last debate, but now I think maybe it was an insane prediction, although it still seems possible that we could see, I mean, I certainly don't think Michelle Bachmann's going to win the nomination, but that we could see kind of a Michelle Bachmann comeback in Iowa, because it seems like she's the one out of all of them that, although she's made mistakes that make her look ridiculous, she hasn't done anything to really alienate the base. She hasn't done anything that would really alienate somebody like, say, Bob Vander Plaats, who's the kind of big religious right kingmaker in Iowa.
Yeah, I mean, her collapse, I don't think that's too strong a word, is really amazing, because she wins the straw poll, and you just assume that is going to catapult her into the lead in Iowa, and perhaps into that national anti-Romney slot, and it just all went downhill immediately, beginning with that dinner event where Rick Perry came in and stepped all over her.
Right, but that's the thing. It seemed to go downhill with Rick Perry, because basically her entire base seemed to move towards Perry.
Yeah.
Now that those people are moving away from Perry, it seems like at least some of them could potentially. Well, I don't know. I mean, I thought some of them would move back to her, although I guess you also have to compare that with her apparent, total ineptitude at actually running a campaign staff.
Yeah, well, I imagine they passed through Perry and moved on to Cain. Yeah, and the staff has been a disaster. It was riven by these awful divisions between Ed Rollins and his crew and kind of the people who were on the bus with Bachman. And then you had this extraordinary spectacle. Every campaign in disarray gives us some spectacle that you just can't believe, but I'm not sure I've ever seen staff, an entire state quit, and the candidate not be aware of it and deny that it's happening, which is just amazing. The McCain campaign had some crazy stuff at the end where, there was a debate over whether people were fired or not. They didn't know whether they were fired. You could talk to 10 different people and all have a different answer on whether someone was fired or not. So I thought the McCain campaign set a pretty high standard for poisonous divisiveness, but Michelle Bachmann is right there.
So we've been talking about kind of right-wing grassroots politics. Maybe we should shift and talk about left-wing grassroots politics.
Let's do it.
So I've been following the right-wing accusations. I'm curious. I'm curious though if you actually believe them. I mean, I know that on the right there seems to be a real belief that Occupy Wall Street is kind of rife with anti-Semitism. That it's a Jew-hating mob. We've seen that in this ad that Bill Kristol has been putting out. That hasn't been at all my experience of Occupy Wall Street, and I think it's interesting that, liberals tend to, since the 60s, are really afraid of the kind of left-wing grassroots. Whenever there's kind of a left-wing grassroots uprising, or at least when there has been in recent years, liberals start to kind of freak out about, are we going to see a rerun of 1968? We don't want to be tarred as dirty hippies. What's interesting to me is that this time, it's not a rerun of it doesn't seem from where I sit to be a rerun of the 60s or 70s. I mean, I think, one of the most iconic moments of the 70s was on Wall Street when the hard hats kind of beat up the hippie protesters in that famous riot. Now you have the hard hats jumped in these protests very early on. There's been tons of union support, and all the polling shows that this movement is more popular, at least right now, than the Tea Party is, and that people, in as much as they know what it stands for, seem to agree with it. So what do you think? Do you think, on the right, there seems to be people are still kind of gleefully pointing to, kind of various embarrassing manifestations of hippie excess. But do you ultimately believe that this is going to kind of blow up in our faces?
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. I have to say I was wrong. I was quite dismissive of this at the beginning, and I've been surprised at how much resonance it's had. I sort of agreed with my colleague Jonah Goldberg, who said, the thing's either it's gonna fizzle out as soon as the weather turns cold, or it's gonna take over the Democratic Party, basically. And it seems
but how can it take over the Democratic Party when, one of the big differences between the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street is that these people are really not even Democrats. Only I think 40% of them identify as Democrats in some of the polls, at least the people who are actually in the park. They don't want anything to do with, a lot of them, I think one of the real faults of the movement is that they're so alienated, they want nothing to do with electoral politics. They're not interested in kind of mobilizing for the primary process the way that the Tea Party was. So, you don't see any politicians going down there except maybe around, I don't know, they're except for like state senators and city council members. So how could this take over the Democratic Party?
Well, they would have to get politically involved. They'd have to follow the example of the Netroots, the kind of anti-war Netroots in the Bush administration, which when it rose up, a lot of people dismissed it as crazy. The New Republic denounced it and said we have to purge these people. Basically,
right. I mean, the New Republic saying that you have to be purged is a pretty good sign of your kind of emerging relevance.
Yeah, no, exactly. No, that's my point. So and then Netroots began, basically took over the party on the foreign policy stuff. But you're right. I mean, if it's just totally about sleeping under tarps and banging the drums and having these endless committee meetings. And I don't know what.
But I don't think it is totally about that. I mean, there's a lot about it that as somebody who kind of does believe in the political process as kind of broken and deformed and depressing as it is, there's a lot of things to kind of criticize in the utopian anarchist elements of Occupy Wall Street. But it's also not just about sleeping under tarps and banging drums. I mean, it's about the fact that they feel like there is no other way to force the country, the political parties, to address widespread economic inequality. And in that sense, they've been kind of successful. I mean, already they have they've kind of shifted a debate. Now people are talking about these really core economic issues that before that people weren't talking about before.
Yeah, but as you were saying earlier, if they're going to take over the Democratic Party, which I think is the main means for such movements to influence American politics, you want to own a party, they have to do more than what they're doing now. And I still think that once people really focus on what they're about, I kind of doubt their popularity will hold up. I tend to think it's just an expression of, at the moment, the high poll numbers you see is just expression of, okay, these people don't like Wall Street, we don't like Wall Street too, therefore we like them. And I think the Tea Party is down partly because they became associated with a big faction in Congress that owns the House majority and has been involved.
Right, and so in that sense, their refusal to engage in politics, as much as I think that that's ultimately kind of destructive, it means that they aren't going to. They don't have kind of political representation for people to turn against.
Yeah, but then they're not going to have political representation,
right.
So they'll
well,
have some airy poll numbers that won't mean anything.
Well, what it will mean, I think the idea is that, just as one of the things that the conservative movement has done really effectively is shift the terms of the debate, so that ideas that used to be considered fringe right-wing ideas, like the flat tax, like the personhood amendment in Mississippi that's about to declare zygotes to be full human beings, what these things do is they shift the debate. They turn previous conservative positions positions that were previously considered very conservative into positions that are now considered kind of centrist. So that Mitt Romney, who's the conservative alternative to John McCain, becomes the unacceptably squishy moderate and is forced to move even further rightward. I mean, so to a certain extent, you're not going to have that effect in primaries, but you can perhaps have that effect on the political debate if you're kind of opening up political positions that had not previously had any political representation.
Well, I think you gotta go primary people, though. I mean, that's how the Tea Party did it. That's how Netroots did it. And again, if they're just going to sleep under tarps, it's not going to come to anything. And I do think there is a real ugliness there. You read their idiotic declaration that they endorsed by this consensus process.
Well, what is the ugliness in that declaration?
Well, please, have you read it?
I mean, there was things in it that I thought was naive, but nothing in it that I thought that I remember, and I don't remember all the details, but I didn't see anything in it that you could describe as ugly or vicious.
So you think corporations are suppressing free speech through the use of the U.S. military?
Wait, I'm sorry, there's a helicopter flying over my house. Can you say that again?
Is it a black helicopter?
It is. They know we're having this conversation.
Yeah, so you think that that's a kind of a rational...
Wait, no, I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said. I heard you say...
Corporations are using the military to suppress free speech? That's a rational view?
No.
Right.
However, can I say one thing that I think is a rational view?
Sure.
that I think you've seen a huge kind of militarization of the police response to protest. There's a lot of things, often when I see the kind of police come charging in, tear gassing people in Oakland last night, there's been a lot of really kind of gratuitous police violence against protesters.
Is that the military doing that?
No.
Oh,
of course it's not. It's the police. But it's
totally a paranoid, irrational view that they adopted by consensus, through their system. They say that corporations are perpetrating colonialism around the world. I mean, this is watered down, leftover Marxism for people who haven't really read Marx or Lenin. It's rancid, left-wing, leftover.
It's not rancid, it's silly. There's a difference between silly and rancid. I mean, to say corporations are clearly doing terrible things all over the world.
But are they perpetuating colonialism?
I'm actually, I'm the only reason I'm hesitant to kind of dismiss that out of hand because our corporations affecting kind of foreign laws and regulations and kind of workplace protections and those sorts of things in a way that say a colonial, that say the British government in India would have done under kind of classic colonialism. I think that probably does happen. Do you?
That's not colonialism. I mean, colonialism, the colonial power goes in and governs.
Right, but this would be a way in which corporations perpetuate some of the iniquities of colonialism and some of the kind of, where you basically have foreign forces having an outsized effect on governments for their own profit. I mean, that's how colonialism, at least in India, began. And it seems that there are elements of that. Do you disagree?
The elements are what again?
Corporations clearly influence things like environmental regulations, worker protections, laws, that they have an outsized, just as they have an outsized impact on American lawmaking and government, they also have an outsized impact on lawmaking and government in foreign countries, where people have even less recourse to challenge them.
Yeah, I don't think most people, when they hear colonialism, that's what they think of. And I'm not even sure that's what they mean. I mean, it seems to me that you're really just sort of grasping.
I think that is what they mean.
That this is sort of very wacky, out there stuff. That if actually people focused on it, no one would agree with it. And I think it's kind of crazy. And there's also the fact that these people have. They try to blame the police for it, but when you shut down the Brooklyn Bridge and have these, go to Times Square. And have these conflicts with police.
They're two different. Those are actually two different things. I mean, shutting down the Brooklyn Bridge, I think,
this would be, they'd be called brown shirts. Basically.
Wait, but these are two different things. I mean, shutting down the Brooklyn Bridge is I think incredibly stupid, and obviously it's a kind of obviously the police cannot let people sit down and stop traffic on the Brooklyn Bridge. Times Square is a public place. People have the right to actually assemble in Times Square. And I would think even as a kind of libertarian, even as a small government libertarian, people on the right as well should be troubled by, there's been like a huge restriction in people's ability to protest. These kind of protester zones, this very onerous permitting process for governing in public places. Again, this use of tear gas in Oakland last night, which, that's not very common. That police here rarely use tear gas against.
Well, it's my understanding. I must admit I haven't followed the rules and regulations of this very closely, but you're not allowed to sleep out places, in public space. So, aren't they bending the rules to occupy Zuccotti Park in the way they are right now?
No, I mean the rules of Zuccotti Park are a little bit, unique because it's a public-private park that's
Right.
open 24 hours.
But you're not. I mean, I just may be mistaken about this, but my understanding is that you're still not allowed to sleep there and camp there under the rules.
I think that you're not allowed to kind of erect structures, which they haven't been able to do. But actually, I don't know whether kind of you're allowed to be there but not be asleep.
Well, I mean, they created basically a little city.
Right, they've created
there,
a small,
and it's not their property. And
but
the
it's
Brooklyn
public
Bridge
property.
is not their property.
Right, but there's a difference. I mean, but it's public property.
What's that?
It's public property. They have a right. You have a right to be there.
Right, but you're not allowed to sleep out in public places unless I'm mistaken.
Well, but I guess, I mean, I don't want to belabor this too much, especially because I don't know the entire kind of New York code or civil code or law code around this, but I do know that, you know, you have a right to be in Zuccotti Park 24 hours a day. It's not like some of our other public parks that have curfews and the hours are limited. Any member of the public has a right to be there at any time.
But sleeping there, living there.
Well, that's what I don't know. Certainly this is kind of they're pushing the rules, but whether they're breaking them, I'm just not sure about.
Yeah, I mean, I would favor them being able to stand around and hold signs, but it just seems to me that letting them create a human and create an encampment there. Well, again, I don't know the rules technically myself, but it doesn't seem a good practice. And things like blocking the Brooklyn Bridge are just outrageous tactics, and I'd be ashamed if the Tea Party ever did such a thing.
So what do you think, we should, I guess, wrap this up, but how do you expect this? Do you think it's just going to kind of fade away as winter comes, or what are you...
Well, again, I don't know. I think if they're going to have a sustained political impact, you have to organize politically, and you have to primary people, primary Democrats. Go after Kirsten Gillibrand, as Bill Kristol has suggested. You know, you have Chuck Schumer and Gillibrand very close to Wall Street, aren't really a populist, I think, by any definition. Go take one of them down, and then you'll have a real impact on the Democratic Party. You'll scare a lot of other Democratic incumbents, and then they'll even listen to you more than they are now, and go further to adopt your agenda, whatever that is. And of course, that's the other problem, is that you.
Although the interesting thing about what you're saying is that one of the things that they highlight is the extent to which the kind of mainstream of the Democratic Party is actually is extremely centrist and kind of is not really beholden to the left.
Yeah, go after them, beat them, take them down.
Well, they're not going to beat. I mean, look, they could go after them. I don't even think they're going to go after them, and they're certainly not going to beat them. What it does potentially do, in kind of what I would ultimately like to see happen, or hope could happen, is that it could highlight the way the entire, highlight the way the entire political discussion has been shifted so far to the right that, say, our incredibly centrist, corporate-friendly president and Democratic Party are considered the kind of ultimate in radical leftism. It might kind of recenter the center. That would be, I think, the most that they could accomplish.
Yeah, I think, you look at the anti-Vietnam protesters, they had primary candidates and they got involved in the political system. You look at the anti-Iraq war, Netroots, same thing. Look at the Tea Party, same thing. So if a movement like this is to have a really enduring impact, there's just no substitute for that political element. And it's totally absent now, but there's no reason to believe that someone who's isn't a little politically shrewder and better organized in this regard isn't going to tap into them and try to make that happen. But if it doesn't, I think it's basically a spectacle, and one that will be very hard to maintain once the snows start falling here in New York.
Well, let's wrap it up there, because that's actually the necessity of political engagement is probably the one thing that we both agree on.
All right, Michelle, I enjoyed it very much. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, thanks for this.
All right, talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.